Welcome to the first part in a four-part series of webinars between ADB Water and the International Water Management Institute under the theme Science and Innovation for a Water Secure Future for All, and brought to you by ADB's water advisory teams. Today, and for the next 3 fortnights, experts from IWMI and their guests will discuss innovative approaches and tools that can contribute towards advancing water security and climate resilience in Asia and the Pacific. They will cover topics such as part 1 today, different ways developing member countries can strengthen resilience through proven water solutions. Part 2, water accounting and how it can help in understanding and managing the food, water, energy nexus. Part 3, irrigation asset management. And lastly, part 4, they will zero in on the circular economy through case studies that demonstrate success. But firstly, I would like to invite Robert Guild, Chief Sector Officer of ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, to say some opening remarks. Over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Jeff, and good day to everybody, wherever you are. Thanks a lot for joining us here today. I'm particularly pleased to welcome IWMI to the series, and I'm really looking forward to these 4 topics that Jeff just ran through, particularly because IWMI and ADB share a common mission to provide water solutions for sustainable and climate resilient development. I hope through our efforts, we contribute to the achievement of the SDGs on reducing poverty and hunger and maintaining a sustainable environment. The topics of this particular 4-part series are really valuable as ADB and IWMI have been collaborating closely to drive the latest knowledge and technology into our operations. And I'd like to cite just a few examples. In the Central and West Asia region, IWMI is enhancing ADB initiatives for improved water resource management through application of remote sensing technology in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, and partnering on institutional strengthening and modernizing irrigation management in Pakistan. We've also worked together on water productivity and deficit studies in several Southeast Asian and South Asian countries. I was really happy that IWMI led the preparation of Key Dimension 2 on economic water security for ADB's recently published flagship report, the 2020 Asia Water Development Outlook. And of course, IWMI is a valuable member of our International Water Advisory Group. We look forward to developing a stronger collaborative partnership as we implement our common visions. So in closing, let me look to the future of our partnership. These webinars are a good way to jumpstart further collaboration around the specific topics to be addressed. We have a solid audience here today who can tell us what they need. But let's not stop with webinars. We should renew our efforts to develop joint programs of work on these 4 topics and others as they come to fruition. Let's bear that in mind as we dive in. So I hope that today's webinar and the 3 yet to come are productive for everyone here, and I look forward to learning more. Back to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Robert. And now I'd like to invite Mark Smith, Director General, International Water Management Institute, to say some opening remarks. Over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Robert, also for your welcoming words. And good afternoon, good morning to those of you in a morning time zone. Really pleased to be with you. Actually, I'm really thrilled to see this webinar series come together. And I want to start by thanking colleagues from both IWMI and ADB for your work in organizing this series and the great slate of speakers that we have across the 4 webinars. It's fruit born from many conversations amongst us as colleagues over the last months and years, recognizing that that there's so much that we can do together. We do together, and that we can do more together because we have interests and strategies that align so well. So I'm really pleased that we're able to now have this concrete and joint step together in bringing together our ideas and our thinking. Yes, we do have a really great record of cooperation on really critical topics in different parts of the region. And we were really pleased to be able to collaborate with ADB on the recently launched Asia Water Development Outlook report. I personally found that a really excellent report, and I expect it's going to be used, which is a pretty important thing for these kinds of reports, and it's going to be influential in helping countries in Asia Pacific to set the priorities and build the needed policies and investments to address their water security challenges in really targeted and concrete ways. And at IWMI, we are committed in this region to supporting countries across the region in doing so, in working on addressing those water security challenges. As you alluded to, Robert, we have a vision of a water secure world, and we have a mission, as you outlined it, providing and delivering water solutions for sustainable and climate resilient development. We do that across a set of programs: water, food and ecosystems, climate change and resilience, water growth and inclusion, and augmented with digital innovation. And the webinar series that we're going to work through over the coming few weeks will engage each of those program areas. And I hope, just as you had expressed, Robert, that that's going to enable us at IWMI and with ADB to dive further into those areas of shared interest, into exchange learning, but also ideas and inspiration of how we can use the latest in science and innovation to contribute to advancing implementation of action on water security, which is, after all, what the AWDO report calls for. I think also this webinar series is very timely. We all hear constantly how the need for concerted action on a whole variety of issues, but water security is one of them, is growing only more urgent. And this is recognized, and I was doing some reading and thinking about this just recently. This is recognized in the UN Water report on the SDG 6 acceleration framework, which identified 5 accelerators: financing, data and information, capacity, innovation, and governance. So IWMI and ADB collaboration is strategic and impactful across all 5 of these accelerators. It can be strategic and impactful across all 5 of them. So I'm really looking forward, therefore, to learning through these webinars, through the dialogues that we will have together, what are the most promising areas for our collaboration to help push that acceleration, so that we can work together on shared goals that we surely have, but also really press the urgency of doing so faster. So with that, I'll close and wish everyone an enjoyable, successful, and productive webinar today and in the series to come. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Mark. And now I'd like to pass it over to Rachael McDonnell from IWMI in Rome to moderate today's session. Over to you, Rachael.
Thank you, Jeff, Robert, and Mark, for setting the scene for this webinar series. I'm Rachael McDonnell, the Strategic Program Director for Water, Climate Change and Resilience at IWMI, and will be the moderator for this webinar. And what we hope to achieve in this webinar is to look at various ongoing discussions and solutions around the centrality of water in climate resilience. So last week was a momentous week for those working in climate change, adaptation and resilience building. And I'm sure many of you were caught between following the Climate Adaptation Summit, rejoicing that the US had rejoined the Paris Agreement, whilst also following the discussions at Davos that highlighted the moment that appears to be a tipping point in the engagement of major organizations in climate change, adaptation and mitigation. It's timely, therefore, in this webinar that we explore experiences and lessons learned in climate resilience building centered on water from across Asia and beyond. I welcome starting these discussions with 5 key points that seem to emerge from the dialogues of the last couple of weeks that are going to help to frame subsequent talks, not only from our colleagues who will be presenting in this work, but also in our discussions going forward. Point number 1. At last week's water anchoring event at the Climate Adaptation Summit, the Dutch Minister of Infrastructure and Water Management said that 90% of climate disasters are water related, either too much, too little, or too dirty. And we know, therefore, that water has to be the center of adaptation to address this 90%. And we're seeing this reflected in those nationally determined contribution reports that countries are pledging as we lead up to the COP26, those renewals, where we're seeing a lot of renewed interest in how can countries adapt and build resilience to these water risks. And so we need to bring those solutions with a water focus. Point 2 is that we're seeing a growing evidence for the need for what is called deep resilience. You will see deep resilience coming out in a lot of the discussions going forward. So what does that mean? It means deep resilience in climate change building. And the idea is that we can't just think in sectors. We have to span sectors. So we have to not just think about water, we have to think beyond water. And in the conversations about deep resilience in the areas that we're thinking about in this webinar series, it's about how can we bring the water, energy, food, and environment nexus, and we have a whole webinar on that, into deep resilience building, because climate change is challenging us to think across traditional silos and boundaries. And how can we bring this connected thinking into our adaptation plans? So we've had water as a climate risk, water we need to think about in terms of deep resilience. And then one of an important paper that's just come out, and it's resonating through quite a bit of the work, is that we're hearing a review of adaptation projects. And there is an ongoing critical review of some adaptation projects in that that adaptation has failed, and they've even brought maladaptation. And I know this is something that Aditi will speak to a little bit about later. And it's often affecting the most vulnerable people in this. And the call is for climate adaptation projects, resilience projects, to very much look at vulnerability from a systemic level and to recognize that these adapt solutions that we're all wanting to develop should be demand-led and designed with strong engagement of local communities that cut across gender, age, culture, religion, and other sectionalities. And these need to be acknowledged in the solutions for that resilience building to be effective. Point 4 that I wanted to bring up is what was really coming out of Davos last week. And in a recent report, the Deloitte report came up with what are global executives really thinking about and where do they rank climate change. And what was shocking in this report, given the pandemic that we're all living through, was that they felt that climate change was still the most serious social threat to their business, even with a pandemic. And what they wanted to do was they're trying to, yes, they're pledging to net zero, but they are looking at resilience building that will protect businesses going forward. And what was also fascinating in a recent study that was just released by New York University Stern Center for Sustainable Business, as they looked at the biographies of 1,188 board members of the 100 largest US companies. And they found that 0.2%, in other words, or 3 board members from these large US companies had any sort of climate change experience, and only 6% had a broader environmental experience, and that will include water in that. So we're seeing at a time of emerging threats to businesses that our leaders are needing this climate change experience and input to support these high-level decision-making. And point number 5 I'd like to make is, again, coming out from Davos and many of the other work that's going on, is there is a massive shift towards how do we finance adaptation, and how does that, how are these changes differing from existing current financing structures? What came from the climate adaptation is saying is there just isn't enough funding to make the changes that we need. But what we are seeing is we're seeing a new set of investors coming into this space. So investors are driving change. So BlackRock's Larry Fink said last week, in March, the conventional wisdom was the crisis would divert attention and capital away from climate. But what they're actually seeing, they saw investors invest more than $288 billion into sustainable assets for sustainable financing. So we know that as we're doing our work in climate change adaptation, we need to bring new financing through blended means, where we bring in development banks like ADB, absolutely, but with donors, but also international climate funds, alongside impact investors, supporting governments and the private sector to build those resilience solutions that is needed to manage those climate risks. So what is needed for this? And this is what hopefully where this webinar will be, will add to it. We need much stronger evidence, we need knowledge, and we need solutions to look at what we are working on and some of where we could take this investment using this great momentum towards climate change management. So in this webinar, we will have 3 talks to bring in first the context and then the latest insight on water and climate change. And after each talk, we will have a chance for questions. So please do add your questions to the chat. And then after this talk, we will open up the discussion so we can explore the area more fully and bring in the thoughts of a wider group. So for the first presentation, I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Richard Betts, who's the Head of Climate Impacts Research at the UK Meteorological Office Hadley Centre, and he's also the Chair in Climate Impacts at the University of Exeter, and is a lead author in the IPCC water chapter. And Richard is going to talk about water at the centre of climate risk. Richard, over to you now.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to join you today for this webinar. So this presentation sets the scene for the discussion on resilience. It's about the role of water in risks from climate change, being at the centre of climate risk. This audience will be very well aware that, of course, water is central to our lives. We need it for drinking, supporting production of food, sanitation, energy, so many other things. But also, too much water is, of course, dangerous or damaging. So you have flooding or waterlogging and so on can be very disruptive and cost lives. So changes in this in water due to climate change are absolutely fundamental to us. And water, of course, is at the centre of the climate system. It is present in the oceans, in the atmosphere, and on land, and it cycles between those. We'll all be familiar with these kind of diagrams of the water cycle. And all aspects of the water cycle can be affected by climate change. So, for example, as temperatures rise, the hotter temperatures can drive more evaporation, both from the oceans and from the land. So more evaporation from the land dries out the landscape. It reduces the availability of moisture in the soil, water in rivers and groundwater, and so on. It should be noted that that can also be moderated by the effects of carbon dioxide on vegetation, which can actually reduce water loss to some extent, although that tails off at higher levels. So that's an additional complexity that needs to be taken into account. But the water, more water can be held in the atmosphere as the atmosphere warms up as well, and that's a key part of the effect of climate change on the global water cycle. But most importantly, in terms of regional climate change and the availability of water, changes in the atmospheric circulation, so shifts in wind patterns can cause changes in rainfall patterns globally, and this is quite fundamental to the availability of water in the climate system in individual places going forward into the future. Another effect of a warming climate is that it increases the intensity of rainfall, both because the atmosphere is holding more water, so there's more there to rain out when it does rain, but also a hotter land surface can drive more convection, more intense thunderstorms, and create greater intense and extreme rainfall events. And actually, it's important to note it's possible for any individual place to both get more intense rainfall and more severe drought in between the intense rainfall because of these changes in the volatility of the water cycle as a result of climate change. And a key point, which I'll come back to later, is that predicting many of these changes is very difficult, and many of them are extremely uncertain, particularly the shifting atmospheric circulation, and therefore whether rainfall in any individual place is going to increase or decrease. Different computer climate models that we use to assess ongoing climate change can give different answers for this in the future. Some will project an increase in rainfall in one place, some will project a decrease in rainfall in the same place. So it's very hard to be sure exactly what will happen in many places. And also, as I mentioned, the role of life, vegetation, and the impact of carbon dioxide on that is a key part of evaporation, and that is not very well constrained from current knowledge either. So there's some key uncertainties there. But despite that, some of these uncertainties, we are confident about the fundamentals of climate change impacts on the water cycle, and we're also confidently able to say now that climate change is already having an impact on many of the aspects of the changes in the water cycle, including water-related extreme events. So over the last decade, a new field of climate change research has emerged called event attribution, which aims to assess the role of climate change in the likelihood and severity of extreme weather events. Many papers get published on this now. One particularly important activity is an annual report in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society, which looks at extreme events in a particular year. And the most recent one came out last week, actually, looking at 2019. And that report looked at 15 events in the year 2019. I've just shown 3 examples of it here, just to show how important some of the water-related events are. Because originally, actually, when this activity started, it was easier to attribute changes in temperature-related extremes to climate change. But now, many of the events that they can be explained from climate change perspective are related to water. So, for example, in 2019, there was a very severe heat wave and drought in southwest China, which affected 2 million people in terms of water shortages, had crop failures over a large area, and had large economic losses as well. And that was assessed to be 43% more likely due to climate change. This is done by using computer climate models to simulate the event itself and the different variations of weather that would be associated with that, and then an alternative world, if you like, a world that might have been, again, within the virtual world of the computer climate model, but without the impact of climate change. And comparing these two can allow you to estimate the change in likelihood of these events. So that event in southwest China was assessed to be 43% more likely, the combination of the extreme hot and extreme dry conditions. Another example that was looked at by the authors was in Canada, in Ottawa. The River Ottawa flooded, and that affected thousands of people in terms of making them having to be evacuated, and over 200 million Canadian dollars in insured losses were incurred. And that the rainfall that was associated with that flooding event was assessed to be 2 to 3 times more likely because of climate change. Obviously, flooding is not just about rainfall, it's also about how wet the landscape is to start with, and where people have built, and so on. So it's more complex than just the rainfall. But the rainfall itself was made 2 to 3 times more likely because of climate change. And then a particularly interesting study from a scientific perspective for 2019 was looking at Hurricane Dorian, which was a devastating hurricane which impacted the Bahamas and other regions in that part of the world. Much of the damage was done by the high winds, of course, and the photo on the right from the front cover of the report is of the damage from Hurricane Dorian. But an important part, as well as the sea level rise as well, was also the intensity of the rainfall, which again caused local flooding. 0.5 meter of rainfall fell over the Bahamas in the hurricane, and that increase in rainfall was attributed to be 5 to 10% more likely due to climate change. I think that's one of the first times that we've been able to show that kind of change being linked to climate change. So we are seeing the impacts of climate change on hydrometeorological extremes already. I've just got a couple of examples of projected changes globally due to changes in climate change impacts on water. First, looking at river flooding, and this is a study published 5 years ago, which is projecting the number of people affected by river flooding at 1.5 degrees global warming. So the minimum we can expect if we achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And of course, bearing in mind we're already at 1 degree global warming. So the authors of that study estimated that currently around about 54 million people are affected by river flooding per year. And at 1.5 degrees global warming, the global numbers for people affected by river flooding went up to around about 78 million per year. I've put the uncertainty estimates in the table there. So it was a 24 million increase in the number of people affected by river flooding. So a 44% increase compared to the present day. And that was just at 1.5 degrees global warming. If the projections are taken on to 2 degrees global warming, again, this is using climate models to drive models of river flows, extreme rivers, and flooding impact. The numbers of people affected by river flooding increases to 97 million, so an increase of 43 million from the present day, or an 80% increase from the present day. If we were to see 4 degrees global warming, which is still quite possible at the current rates of emissions, it's kind of at the upper end of the possibilities, but it's very, very possible with current emissions scenarios by the end of this century. If we see 4 degrees global warming, that could lead to over 200 million people affected by river flooding, so more than 150 million extra people affected by flooding, so nearly a 300% increase compared to the present day. So quite large numbers, and the map has shown which individual countries are seeing the increases or decreases. The increases are in red, decreases are in green. You've seen that most of the countries are actually seeing an increase in the number of people affected by flooding. And this bar chart adds more detail to that, and it gives the absolute numbers for selected countries. So the colours are showing for individual levels of global warming, with grey is the present day baseline, green is 1.5 degrees, orange is 2 degrees, and 4 degrees global warming is shown in red. And the black lines in the middle show the average of a set of projections. Several different climate models were used for this. Black is the average of all the projections, and the width of the bars is the range of outcomes. And the countries are ranked in terms of the number of people affected. So China at the top is projected to be seeing 50 million people per year affected by flooding, compared to around about 10 million people per year at the present day. And you can actually see that most of the top ranked countries in terms of the number of people affected by flooding are in Asia. Largely because of the severe increases in rainfall there, but also because of the large populations who are exposed. But one of the key points here is that there's quite a large range of uncertainty in the number of people affected, because, as I said earlier, you can't quite pin down exactly what's going to happen in terms of the regional climate change, although the consensus in many places is still towards an increase in the risk of flooding. And then the last example I wanted to look at was about water scarcity. So this can be measured in terms of the amount of water available versus the amount of water that's demanded. So it depends on both the availability of water, how much is actually there, and also the number of people who need to use it. And this study looks at, first of all, the present day metric of water scarcity, the water scarcity index, in the map at the top. And you can see that varies quite widely across the world. And then the lower map shows the projected changes in water scarcity by the year 2050. And this is including both climate change and projected population change. And it's the median of several different projections, both of climate change and of population. And you can see that overall, water scarcity is projected to increase in the median in many areas. But again, there's large uncertainty in this, and this is a particularly important part of the challenge for adaptation. So this study characterises future changes in terms of the policy challenges for adapting to water scarcity, and it defined the challenges both using the projected change in water scarcity averaged across all the different sets of projections. So higher increases of water scarcity contributed to higher challenges for policy for climate adaptation. It's more difficult to adapt if there's less water per person, of course. But another important part was the uncertainty in the future projections, where the models disagreed on the rainfall changes or on the population changes. Then that was an additional increase to the level of policy challenge. So the very highest policy challenges are in places where there's high water scarcity in the average of all projections, but also a large increase in the uncertainty in the future projections, because that makes it difficult to plan if you're putting in place infrastructure, more dams or pipelines and so on. That requires a huge investment, and it's difficult to put that investment in place if it's not certain there's going to be a benefit. So that can be quite a challenge for effective planning to improve resilience to water scarcity. So just to summarise then, water is clearly central to human life and society, and its presence and its movement in the climate system are central components of that. Climate change is already affecting water-related extreme events, and it will continue to do so, and it will continue to shift the presence and movement of water as we go on into the future. But we can't be sure exactly how this will play out. And this uncertainty is a major challenge to adaptation to climate change, especially for addressing water scarcity as well as flooding. And that was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was a terrifically, in such a short time, you synthesized so many of the findings, so many of the challenges that we're having to deal with in managing climate change. We welcome any questions for Richard. We have 5 minutes to take any questions if there are any. And whilst people are busy typing away, perhaps I can ask you a question, Richard. So, for example, I'm head of water at the ADB. How would I use these projections, given the uncertainty, for planning investments to help the people that we want to manage water scarcity or to manage flooding? And I'm sure that's a question that gets asked all the time.
You would look at it from your own perspective about, from a sort of risk assessment perspective, what are the consequences of particular scenarios playing out. Although as a climate scientist, I can't tell you what will happen to water in the area or sector you're interested in, but I can tell you a range of possibilities and perhaps even give estimates of the likelihoods of certain changes. So you would look at it from your perspective, what happens in a particular scenario, and then look at what measures would be needed to guard against that, based on your judgment of the severity of the risk from that perspective.
Okay, it's a great one in the chat here, Richard, and it says, can you give examples for transitional versus transformational policy changes?
Transformational changes would be the most fundamental changes, such as entirely new national level water infrastructure implementation, or changes in governance process and so on, as opposed to simply evolving them. So rather than improving existing water management practices or existing infrastructure, actually reinventing entirely new ones. That's kind of the difference between the two. Yeah.
It's fascinating hearing, the various discussions on impact investment and blended finance. They're often those large transformational ones, but then you have complexities in politics and social and economic challenges that for technology to deal with. That's terrific, Richard, and thank you very much. I know this is a very tight presentation, so thank you very much for your time. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our colleague Aditi Mukherji. She's a principal researcher at IWMI New Delhi office. She's a coordinating lead author for the water chapter of the IPCC report, which we're all waiting to come out, and is a member of the core writing team, member for the AR6 synthesis report, which many of us will rely on to gain that knowledge. So over to you, Aditi, and your talk is on the centrality of water and adaptations, early results from a meta review. Thank you, Aditi.
Thank you so much. And Richard, wonderful presentation. So you have created the backdrop against which I want to propose that just as the impacts on climate change, impacts on water are pretty central to the entire climate change discourse, so is the role of water in adaptation. So water features importantly in the way we are impacted, but also water can play a very important role in the solution. So both water comes in kind of both ways. And what I'm going to present is the early result from a meta review that was supported by the ACIR, the Australian Council Centre for International Agricultural Research, and part of it also gets reflected in some of the assessment work that we are doing. Just to recap the global challenge, I don't need to, but you have already very nicely put, Richard, that hydrological cycle, climate change is impacting every component of that cycle. For us who work in the CG system, and the CGIR looks at the food systems, so the changes in water cycle is also affecting food systems. Then I have already said the central argument for my presentation is that water is central to adaptation. And something that I wouldn't talk about it so much, but I want to put it on the table in a discourse on climate change, that many of the mitigation measures have high water footprint that we often don't look at. And that's something I think is very important. But as I said, I will be focusing more on the role of water in adaptation in my presentation today. The main questions that I'm trying to answer through this work of meta-analysis, which was a huge exercise, still kind of ongoing, is how important is water in the adaptation space? Do current water adaptation response actually help in reducing some of the risk that, Richard, you talked about? Are those responses transformational? I saw that comment from Stephen. Very good question, Stephen. And we try to answer that through a meta review of 1800 plus papers that we have scanned through and coded, and I'll come to that. Justification, I think this audience, which is primarily a water audience, doesn't need this justification, though I have talked to non-water audience, and it has been, I have had to convince that, water is important for adaptation. But for this audience, I think this is something self-evident, that if mitigation is about energy, is about carbon, then adaptation is about water. But if that is so, then why do we have such little synthesis of those thousands? We all know that there are thousands and thousands of case studies that actually document water-related responses of adaptation, but yet there is such little synthesis. And what we don't know, even more importantly, and is very important that we know, is do these responses actually work? So just very quick definition of what do we mean by water adaptation response in this meta review that we have done. So we have said something is a water adaptation response if either the risk is a combination of hazard, vulnerability, exposure. Some of the maps that Richard just showed you about the population at risk, so that would be basically the risk map. If any of it is about water, it could be floods, droughts, rainfall variability, then any adaptation measure, such as even it may not be like, quote unquote water related. It could be something like a law or a new institutional arrangement, or in urban context, for example, will count as water adaptation. The second part is, if the risk is also not directly water related, it could be like high heat and thermal discomfort, etc., leading to ill health, but the response to that is water related. It could be some kind of traditional method of indoor cooling, maybe with water, then it's also counted as water adaptation. Just to put that up front so that the audience knows what we mean by water adaptation. Either the risk is water or the response is water. Response could be irrigation, water management, farm water, soil moisture. So there's like a long list of what those could be. With that, once we do that, the second question, I think, $1 million, $1 trillion question really is, are those adaptation responses working? We all know that majority of the adaptation response in the global south and in Asia, where ADB works, are mostly autonomous. There isn't a lot of planned response that you might find in global north. So the question is, do we know if those adaptation options are actually reducing the risk, climate, but also a lot of associated risks? And the answer is broadly no. There have been in the recent years, and starting from the earlier IPCC special report on AR5, there have been some interesting discourse that has emerged around effectiveness as well as feasibility of both adaptation and mitigation responses. But I don't think we have a consensus on it yet. The IPCC, the current draft, in one of the chapters, they do quite a nice job of defining what effectiveness is, and our definition is quite close to that. So here for us, we have defined a response to be effective or non-effective, that is potentially maladaptive, if it reduces risk through changes, positive changes in outcomes of any of these 6 parameters. These parameters that we have considered are financial, economic, outcomes from vulnerable people, water-related outcomes, ecological, environmental outcomes, socio-institutional outcomes, and any other outcomes. I'll come to some of these in a minute. The review protocol, like any other review protocol, it kind of relies on keyword search, screening, and database. For this, we relied on this, another work that is going on with some of the other IPCC colleagues, but it's independent work apart from the assessment. It's called the GAMI database, Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative. So they have actually got a database of 2000 plus papers, and we used the same paper and we derived our own different coding protocol. So that's kind of what we did. So of these around 2000 studies, which later turned out to be around more like 1800 some studies, I have the number somewhere, because some were duplicates. We then developed 6 inclusion criteria to see whether that study fits in within our analysis. First, it has to be about water adaptation, as we have defined earlier. It has to be an adaptation that has been actually implemented, as opposed to an adaptation that is being planned for the future. The third part was that particular study needs to have evaluated the impact or effectiveness of that adaptation in some ways, either in some kind of a causal way or through a well-enunciated theory of change. I mean, both are not, of course, exclusive. It includes at least one tangible indicator of effectiveness, as we have mentioned in the previous slide, those 5 or 6 indicators of effectiveness, that the paper should have been published in and after 2014. That's just to limit the number of studies we are looking at. There is nothing sacrosanct about that number. Or that was also the period that was captured in the AR5, sorry, the previous assessment. And the paper has enough information. So with those kind of things, this is kind of the coding protocol. All the papers were coded across some 100 variables, and these were the main sections. You know, first the inclusion, exclusion. Papers that were excluded were not further coded, and the papers that were included were coded based on the response, what was the risk against which the response was happening, effectiveness, enabling conditions, and data and methods. So I won't go in further detail. So now coming to the results. So we had around 1825 unique papers published on adaptation after 2014. Of these, we found that around 1,500 papers were around water-related adaptation, but of which only 1,200 were adaptation that was actually has been implemented. A lot were talking about either planned adaptation, future adaptation, or were theoretical. So out of these 385 papers where effectiveness was measured, and out of these 325 papers where the measure was found to be effective. I will come to all these results in a while, so I'm not explaining more here. Then we coded all these papers on a platform called SysRev that enables a lot of people to code it. And we had some 28 coders from around the world coding all these papers with us. Here you see 2021 articles, because as I said, 200 plus articles turned out to be duplicates. Okay, now coming to the main messages that this work got us was the majority of adaptation response are water related. By the definition I have said already, either the risk is water or the adaptation response is water. 82% I said is around water. So yes, so that's the main one, that water is central to adaptation. The second one is droughts and floods are the main hazards that are being captured in all those documents. Those are all peer-reviewed scientific articles. Majority, I mean, almost all of them are journal articles. There are some book chapters as well. And the fact that droughts and floods are the most important hazard is something I think Richard has also shown, and this is all of us who work on water. I think this is kind of pretty mainstream. I don't have to explain it more. When it comes to location of those water adaptation case studies, this was a global review, and you can see a large chunk of them comes from Asia, followed by Africa. And within Asia, there's a lot of studies from China, as well as the 4 South Asian countries, India, Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, yes, and also quite a number from Sri Lanka. We have quite a chunk of it in Southeast Asia. So this kind of gives you an idea. We have another piece of work that some of my colleagues did, where we look at the case studies on future adaptation. There, quite interestingly, majority of those are from global north, either from US or from Northern Europe. That's because perhaps in the global south, in Asia and Africa, we aren't yet talking enough about adapting to the future. My third high-level message is that this is already done, are being implemented in Asia and Africa. The fourth high-level message is almost 80% of water adaptation responses are also in the agriculture sector. We coded all the papers according to which sector it belonged to, and we can find that the majority of the papers were in agriculture, followed by water-induced disasters. After that, we had urban, peri-urban, and health and sanitation. And here you can see the blue part of the bar graph shows studies that did not do effectiveness analysis, and the orange part is the one that shows studies that did effectiveness analysis. That brings me to the fifth message, which is only quarter of studies measure effectiveness of water adaptation responses. And of this, I have taken out a slide. I'm also talking about quality of studies. Of these 385 studies, actually only around 70 or 80 of those studies are of high quality, where there is some kind of an attribution, like the adaptation response has been actually causally linked to the adaptation outcome. Majority of the studies do not have such a good causality kind of linkage. So only a quarter of the studies document effectiveness of adaptation. I think that's a very important finding, because either it be autonomous or it be planned adaptation, billions of dollars are being spent on adaptation, and we know so little about its effectiveness. So, and of the studies that we found, of the majority studies, like 325 out of 385 measure effectiveness, also shows those are effective. I think this always shows our bias towards documenting success stories. This is the same thing. Basically, here what we have done is we had developed around 16 major groups of adaptation, of which I have conflated it into 9, because otherwise it just gets too messy. The major category of sector where adaptation is happening, as I said, was around agriculture, that's crops, fisheries, etc., followed by water related. And you can see that majority of the studies do not do effectiveness analysis. The third category was collective action, migration, flood risk reduction measures, training and capacity building, financial incentives, and urban sector. Then my final message is that irrigation, water management, improved agronomic practices are some of the more effective responses. This is a bit of an involved diagram, but overall, the darker the shade, it means that there are more number of studies showing that these are on the rows are each of your adaptation responses: improved cultivars, changes in cropping pattern, on-farm irrigation, water soil management. These are the top 4. And it shows that there's a lot of evidence around those. The dark one shows that there are at least 40 studies. Then the number of these small circles inside show what is the quality of that study. So the darker circle and the higher number of these circles actually show that we have a higher level of confidence around the results. Then also many of these also have some co-benefits. For example, agroforestry has a lot of co-benefits in terms of mitigation, and a lot of them also have a lot of maladaptive outcomes. I don't talk about it so much here, but I think that's well documented. So our main concern is that majority of these adaptation options that are known to be effective are mostly incremental in nature and not transformative enough. So for some of the transformative ones are somehow of farm diversification, perhaps economic and financial incentives and trainings, capacity building could be some of the transformational adaptation. We don't know for sure, but they could be because they do address partly the root causes of vulnerability. I think we have to keep coming back to the root causes of what makes people vulnerable to climate change. Now, very briefly, I know I've kind of reached my time limit, but I just wanted to give an overview of what IWMI does in the space of water adaptation. So basically, 4 different things within the water adaptation work. We look at climate change adaptation, waterproofing, climate change mitigation, role of water in climate security, and climate finance. I don't go into it so much. 2 examples, Rachael has said to provide some 2 examples from some of the work we are doing. A very quick example is some of our work has been helping in reviving mountain springs, where we are combining hydrogeology and community knowledge. We identify recharge areas through science, but also community action. Then we do recharge interventions and shows results that water discharge in mountain springs have gone up. Our other very interesting work, for which a webinar is kind of going on right now, after this I'll go and join one of those, is working with solar irrigation pumps. And in India and in elsewhere in South Asia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, we have been experimenting with grid connection, where we are giving farmers the option of providing, having a solar pump, connecting that pump to the grid, and providing them incentives to pump less groundwater by actually making it possible for them to sell the solar electricity back to the grid. So that's on the one hand making the grid cleaner, but also providing income to farmers who in areas where groundwater is already overexploited. So with that, if these tariffs are attractive, farmers then reduce water use. Our evidence, this graph shows that over the years, you can see the orange part of the graph is where farmers have been selling electricity back to the grid. So they have been reducing their water use. And so that is all that, yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aditi. That was a tour de force on I know what is a phenomenal work, bringing together all the findings on adaptation to be able to begin to put together what are effective solutions and where are those adaptation plannings at the moment. It was interesting how agriculture was so dominant and WASH was much less. We've got some great questions coming in here. I hope you're happy to answer them. So Srinivasan said, is the low number of studies that looking at effectiveness analysis related to the lack of good metrics for effectiveness or of adaptation?
I think majority of the studies don't even are not designed to even measure effectiveness. For instance, a lot of the studies in the adaptation field are simple case studies that end up describing what the adaptation intervention was, and very loose description of what may have, you know, if it had contributed. But I think the major issue is around robustness and gearing those studies towards measuring what needs to be measured.
Fantastic. Another good question is asking about regulatory frameworks as part of disaster risk reductions to prevent flooding disasters due to man-made hazards such as environmental degradation and unregulated changes to land use plans. So how much of it can we use regulatory frameworks for helping to bring adaptation effectiveness?
Yes, as I said, this is a bit like preliminary. We just finished, like, it was a 6-month study, believe it or not. So there's this huge amount of data that we haven't completely dug in. But one of the categories was around policies and institutions and regulatory frameworks. And I believe a lot of the urban flooding literature is around better regulation in the cities, not so much about the rural flooding issues. And within the flood literature, the other part that has come up quite well is the difference between hard infrastructure versus more softer interventions. And there, I think the consensus seems to be that hard infrastructure kind of, you know, without those other interventions do not quite work. But it's not a complete answer because there's so much of the database that we still need to dig in.
And many people are saying what a great presentation. And yes, the presentations will be shared. Jeff has already provided a link in the chat, but we're happy to do it. One last question. What portion of adaptation studies focus on an emphasis on social learning / collective action?
Of the effective studies, maybe around 10-15%. Not more than that. Yes, so that would be the number. And some of the studies are actually very, very interesting. They talk about a lot of the upcoming studies are really about local knowledge and how indigenous knowledge has been used for adaptation. And I feel that's something we have to be on the lookout on and focus more on, looking at these indigenous and local perspectives.
And I'm going to sneak one more question in because it's really good, big, and it refers to a number of questions there. Are there any generalized lessons from adaptation responses which were not effective? For example, sectors. Are particular sectors more vulnerable for being maladaptation or for adaptation being not effective?
I don't think, because given that only less than 25% of the studies even did anything to measure effectiveness, and even within that, I said, again, a quarter of those were actually high quality causal attribution kind of studies. And I saw one point, I can't remember who, somebody said it takes time. Yes, maybe that is one of the things, because after you have done adaptation intervention, it takes 5 to 10 years for you to actually know the impact. So it's time consuming. So I don't think any particular sector comes out on top, because again, the majority of the studies are in agriculture. I think it's also in agriculture that you see a lot of example of maladaptation. There's also a lot of example of maladaptation in the urban infrastructure. So those are the two that are on top of my head that I can say. Yeah.
Thanks, Aditi. Thank you very much for that. And now we've heard a lot in both Richard and Aditi's work about droughts and floods. So it's my pleasure to introduce Giriraj Amarnath, who's the research group leader for water risks to development of resilience at IWMI, based in IWMI, Colombo, Sri Lanka. And he's going to talk to us about building up resilience to climate hazards like floods and droughts. Over to you, Giriraj.
So I think it was great to hear from Aditi and Richard on the background of climate change and adaptation. And here we specifically look on turning from risk to resilience, and how IWMI's innovations and the solutions over the last couple of years, we have helped number of donors, including the smallholder farmers, in regard to these technologies and how it has leveraged over the years. And that's the focus of this. And in terms of topics, I would go more detail about understanding risk and investing in resilience, how our programs have shaped over the years, and some of our risk knowledge products, particularly with ADB a couple of years before, and some of the tools we developed for disaster management agencies, etc. Innovations in climate risk insurance, when we talk about reducing vulnerability and enhancing resilience. And I just want to bring this particular picture here for everyone to understand here. The disaster risk reduction has been not spoken in recent years. It has been growing significance in number of field. When we talk about sustainable development, we talk about social forestry. There have been a number of areas where disaster risk management has been going on for more than 4 to 5 decades. And the guidelines have come through the major agreement globally is the Sustainable Development Goal and the Sendai framework. And while these agreements have been done at different periods or in different months, we can really see those binding agreements across this SDG, the Paris Agreement, and as well as the Sendai framework. And if we look closely in all these areas, one cannot achieve alone this agreement, where each one have to contribute in terms of reducing the risk, in terms of contributions to understanding the climate change from the Paris Agreement, and how disaster risk reduction can play a big role. And if someone is looking at resilience development, they need to look closely. One cannot achieve hunger, one cannot achieve the poverty, as long as you don't look at understanding the climate change impact, rising temperature, extreme events. So there is really a clear binding that has come from this global arena. And again, these global agreements are looking more at a local level when it talks about the resilience. That's a main highlight I would just want to bring it here. And it's quite positive in terms of globally, we see the disastrous risk as in terms of the mortality is quite low over the years. We can see here the lines are falling down over the last 20 years plus, but obviously there are certain years where we also see a spike in number of people passed away due to natural disasters like hydrometeorological disasters. And over years, these are not estimated model. These are observed economic losses. It's also very clear we are talking about somewhere about 600 to 700 billion US dollar economic losses as per the global disaster database, which is roughly about 2.4% of the region's GDP, including the drought impact. So we can imagine the scale of one side, people are induced mortality is low, but on the other side, the extreme events are increasing over the years. And in terms of the economic loss, while adaptation is fundamentally important, adaptation and mitigation, but it's equally important, relevant policies, relevant preparations in the whole phases of disaster risk management, whether it is preparedness, whether it is recovery, early warning system, and also the response strategy, the policy relevances all need to work one-to-one. One cannot just say, I have an early warning system, I could able to reduce the loss of life. Yes, it's possible, but equally we also need to build resilience infrastructure, the climate financing, what Rachael has spoken about it. So we need to look at the balancing side of risk management framework collectively here. Now, one of the first steps we have done a couple of years is to understand where really the risk exists. So we looked at a global data. And again, thanks to a lot of UN and World Bank and various global organizations making the data publicly available, this shows that a lot of opportunities to collectively put together the framework of defining risk, what Aditi mentioned about understanding hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. You could able to quantify the levels of risk. It's clearly defined here in terms of the regions of South Asia, Southeast Asia, regions in Africa, and also part of South America. There is a different levels of risk is there. And how do we do that? We looked at only the water related hazard like floods, landslides, and drought. And it gave us a clear findings of where the climate investment plans should be developed. And only this is at a national level. And then we also looked at a sub-national level. So we have now a fine scale gridded data of present and future at a 500 meter gridded data, and more can be read in this publications available in IWMI research report of 170. And I must also say that there has been a growing support came from ADB, from the South Asia department. How do we define the hazards from 9 different hazards? This also include earthquake as well. And again, all the natural disasters have been mapped at a very fine resolution. You can go at a sub-district level from India, Nepal, Pakistan, not included Pakistan here, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka. It again helps the investors like ADB, where the climate risk are there, what levels of adaptation need to be done, how do we convince the government to target investments in regions where highly vulnerable or areas of high risk is there. And it really promotes a lot of understanding in the overall phases of disaster risk management. And again, this data has been shared to ADB a couple of years before. And we are in the process of preparing a better atlas, digitally available. Given the post-COVID, there are no opportunities for people to look at hard copies. So we are trying to make a digital success story on this. We will reach out to ADB and see opportunities how we can promote this knowledge product. And the usefulness of these hazard is that yes, hazard can be captured through model data or by remote sensing. But then again, there is a lot of opportunities if you look at the geospatial intelligence analysis we have done, where we looked at 9 different hazards, understanding the population exposure and the gender vulnerability data coming from the World Bank and the GDP, etc., including the historical loss events, etc. So the beauty of all this geographical information is that you could collate and integrate model data, socioeconomic data, and understand a given area of multi-hazard risk, what kind of exposures are there. And we have also mapped the areas where flood gender vulnerability maps could be developed again using the publicly available UNDP database. So the message is that when you collate and integrate this information, I think you could, a lot more plannings can be done from the disaster risk perspective, and also referring into the sustainable climate financing areas where you could target this intervention. That's a scope of getting this broader picture of a national level to subnational initiatives in terms of the understanding how technologies can clearly play a big role here. Now, there has been a lot of activities when it comes to hydromet optimization. We know there is extreme events are happening everywhere, both floods and drought or heat waves, any other form of water-related risk. And what IWMI has come out with that is a number of variables that can explain where the hydromet instrumentations can be optimized. So knowing the rainfall variability in a region of South Asia, understanding where the extreme rainfall more than 200 millimeter or 150 millimeter of rainfall locations, elevations that are suitable, areas where the floods that are already reported, and then you could come with a form of optimizing the areas where these data sets can be used by the, particularly by the banks like ADB to know, because often if you want to talk about early warning or any kind of adaptation measures, you do not have a quality data. And governments are slowly getting out the manual data measurements, and it will be good to look at automated weather stations. And this is a crude data analysis, and then more can be worked out when we look at the fine scale analysis of this product. And again, we use a cloud-based framework so that these are scalable to any part of the world. And again, rule-based optimizations are adapted here so that the users have a choices to optimize how much stations they would like to install in an ecological region or a climate sensitive hotspots areas. Now, I would also move from climate screening or understanding climate hotspots into more practical projects we have done in both floods and drought. Speaking of drought, quite a significant work is in South Asia, Middle East, and Southern Africa. A number of partners and development agencies are supporting this initiative, like Rachael is leading this MENA drought region, Middle East and North Africa. A lot of great work is going on. Again, the principles of following the drought risk management, preparedness, early warning, understanding the impact of vulnerability, and also looking at the drought response strategies. And again, we work with the Indian Council of Agriculture Research in India, not just monitoring information, but tailoring those information to the management aspect as well. That's a focus of a number of works we are doing there. And what eventually these technology or the risk management understanding is that from the example of South Asia, I could speak of here, where you have a lot of remote sensing information, you can characterize drought indicators, understanding the drought risk from the long-term perspective. If you have a data cube of drought information over the last 20 years, we know the severity levels, we know a better way of short-term and long-term remedial measures one could develop, and feeds into the more information dissemination, like agrometeorological advisories. A lot of information are still not being reached out to the communities or even to the extension department. So we need to look at understanding this process. And the other aspect is, once you have this information, understanding the vulnerability levels so that we know a watershed program can be developed, or any kind of periods where there is a severe drought, you can promote other livelihood opportunities. And those are the mitigation and response strategies I would think of proposing here. And what our drought surveillance systems have done so far is basically we capture through the remote sensing and atmospheric models on understanding the severity levels on a weekly basis, provide this information to the member states who are interested and using this information, and also educating the farmers well in advance what we can do better if we know a kind of dry spell is going to come, we know there is an anomaly in the monsoon, or we know there is a mid-season calamity. How do you rotate the crop? What are the management practices one could adopt? And it's equally also important that we educate the farmers in terms of the kind of values we are getting, so that we get trust building with the farmers itself directly. And also it is important for the decision makers to have information in handy so that they make a timely decision. Droughts are more like what we call is a slow moving tsunami, and it is important to understand and take a right decisions on the response strategy. In fact, IWMI has been recognized last year for the work we have done over the last 6 years on winning the Global Geospatial Award from the geospatial industry. And I just want to bring, yes, knowledge informations are there, collective field solutions are very important. But if we look at overall value chain of our monitoring framework, is one, it provides a regional information. It allows the member states to collaborate each other. Drought is also again like a transboundary cooperation is very important. If someone doesn't release the water from the hydrological drought perspective, there can be a downstream community that can have a severe impact. And again, I would also like to speak in the following slides on bundling solution is very important. Rather than just look at a standalone issues, how do we address that? And delivering drought early warning messages is still not going very well. It's more about weather related issues, but how do we look weather to agriculture practices? So a lot more need to be done. And timely early action to finance is also very important. We can alert the communities in terms of the lack of rainfall, but how do we translate those knowledge into a financing side is very important. And I think a lot of country like India has been focusing a lot on watershed program for drought proofing. And again, it brings the overall IWRM principle, integrated water risk management framework. It's very important. And it is in some states, it is sidelined. A lot of new things need to be done on these areas of understanding the integrated water risk management principle, where we talk about water security, water scarcity, but the fundamental policies and institutions need to play a big role here. My last section of work is on how climate insurance can play a big role in increasing resilience. IWMI has done quite a bit of work on index-based flood insurance and bundling insurance with seeds and climate services. But prior to that, I just want to show we have already seen the loss and damages coming from the climate change that was presented by Richard as well, where I already mentioned about the rising natural extreme events are going there, where you see a blue line where we don't have insured losses. So there is a clear protection gap between the insured and uninsured losses. And we also see that the recent adaptation report came. Lot of fund is more on the mitigation aspect. Really 95% of the funds are available for mitigation, greenhouse emission, whatever technology we talk about, but less is available on the 5% of budget is just about adaptation. Now, if you want to really look at closing the protection gap, we need to look at other technologies that can help communities and help government to reduce the building the financial resilience, I would say, and also reducing the loss of crops here, right? So this is how do we do that better? Increasing the availability of insurance product to the poor and vulnerable communities. That's one part of the way you can reduce the protection gap. And the other evidences recently came from UN report is that if you increase 1% of insurance penetration, the disaster recovery burden on developing countries will increase by 22%, right? So this really shows that it's not just about aim of coming up with adaptation goals, but also ensuring a system in place where farmers are getting better resilience and spoken about the areas where vulnerabilities are better structured in the years to come when it talks about the climate resilience program. Now, when we all talk about the private sectors, it's all about finding a right kind of a data to support them. So specifically in the insurance sectors, it's always important to have a quality data, reliable information, and the reliable sources of data that can be available to them, so that these insurance products are reachable to any form of the communities who need this product, and also better coordination among public and private sectors. So I will speak about two examples here. We have built an index-based flood insurance largely based on earth observation data as well as the flood models. And the idea is that this provides us knowing where the levels of severity and the levels of extent of damages that has happened. And we integrate that with the socioeconomic data, the crop damage, the housing impact, and then work with the value chain partner, whether it's a government, insurance sector, or the development partners here. And we were able to roll out to a number of farmers in both India and Bangladesh. And you can see these are some of the sites where we have been rolling out these products in India, Bangladesh, and we just rolled out a product also in Sri Lanka last year. So the scope here is that we want to have more proofing on the product itself so that farmers and the policymaker understand the level of severities captured by earth observation as well as the model data. And we have designed a product at a village level. So compensations are being developed at a village level, which is about 2 to 3 square kilometer area. And over 150,000 payout has been given over the last 3-4 years. And the important is not about the numbers here. It's about how do we convince the next partners, whether it's a private sector, whether it's a government. So we have seen already in Bangladesh, the rolling of this product by insurance companies already happening over 100,000 households. We are already seeing in India, a private sector is adopting a bundling insurance, which I just speak about the weather risk management, scaling over 25,000 households. So these are some welcoming evidences. We feel satisfying that the knowledge and the research we develop is being used by the next user here. And as I spoke about the bundling insurance, so we are looking at a comprehensive risk before flood, during flood, and after flood. And again, we provide weather advisories, providing a crop condition index, and providing the insurance company what's the kind of claim will come out, and providing importantly all the required information, whether it's a type of seed, whether it's a type of digital banking, the payments are being made, the farmers are receiving the mobile-based weather information, etc. Now, in summary, I just want to highlight here the solutions what I have presented here for ADB being an investor here, where these solutions can build momentum to climate action and provide a transformative pathways in a resilient economy. That's one of the main areas we have been building on. And equally, we build public and private partners in de-risking the agriculture risk across the smallholder farmers. And it's all about today not looking at solution as a silo. So we need to look at bundling topics, whether it's insurance with agriculture sector or water management measures need to be collectively looked at, credit, saving, everything. A problem cannot be looked at individual challenges here. And also strengthening the relevant institutions. While we build the new solutions and products, someone have to scale, someone need to have this technology transferred. So we are equally promoting that. And last but not least, building the South-South learning here. Thanks again for giving this opportunity. Over to you, Rachael.
Thank you, Giriraj. Comprehensive and great to see the use of digital technology linked to policies, linked to agricultural financial risk or climate financial risk instruments such as insurance to help the building back. There are some useful questions. I'm going to ask you one, Giriraj, and then what we will do is we'll open it up for questions for other people, so we have a much more of a dialogue. So one question here is, are there any location-specific standards with guidelines and specification for build back better resilience infrastructure to reduce future flooding disasters?
I would say it is happening now under this UNDRR Sendai commitments. People are reporting the local to national commitments in terms of the evidences they have captured, whether it is using the early warning system, how communities have empowered, and using the weather stations, and how the insurance companies are using the data. So a lot of guidelines are getting developed when it talks about achieving the 2030 framework of understanding risk, promoting the financial resilience, and the governance aspect. All are shaping up. I would say in the next 5 years, we will have most of the countries will be reporting these evidences through the form of impact that they have achieved on reducing the loss of life and protecting the infrastructure as well, I would say.
Okay, thank you. So I'd love to open this up. So Richard, Aditi, and Giriraj, keep your cameras on. And now we'd very much like to open up so if you'd like to raise your hands, and we can have much more of an interactive session. So Kalasa Nathan, I see you have your hand raised. Would you like to ask a question? One of the interesting questions in the chat that I'd like to raise at this stage, and maybe we need your help as well, Jeff, is it says here, what is the process of a local government in getting assistance from IWMI and or ADB to study its current water situation and help it develop water relevant plans, policies with a target of meeting SDG 6 in its own ways, with its own resources in its own locality? So Aditi or Giriraj, would you like to sort of think about, give us an insight on how we would work with local areas on their adaptation planning?
Rachael, I think the work that we are doing with the NAP, that is one good entry point in helping the countries fine tune those, perhaps providing some water related inputs. And I know a lot of the work we at IWMI do is with local governments, and I'm just thinking again of a project I manage around solar irrigation. That's we are working with the relevant renewable energy departments in each of these countries. But I'm not sure if that was the exact question. But what I want to say is that we are already working with a lot of these local and national governments.
Giriraj, how are you working? Are you working at a national level, or how are you engaging and bringing those tools and technologies to countries?
I would say on multiple fold we are looking at. For example, we are working with some private sectors, asking them to install the weather stations, and they making more of a value chain of this information and sharing for us, and also using in their internal insurance aspect or any form of other data services they are promoting. I think it is also important to say, unless the collectively these local to national issues are not looked at closely, the issues of disaster risk management or the broader adaptation issues are not achieved in many of the vulnerable or hotspot regions.
Okay. Thanks, Giriraj. Richard, one of the questions that we were engaging with in the chat was people were asking us, so how much can modeling be used for policy planning and development? And I saw there was a great question there from PUB Singapore on that, and they were saying how they use modeling. Can you give us an insight on where you've seen modeling used well in the world, and where it should come with a health warning or an investment, a financial health warning?
Right. Yes. Sure. Yes. So yeah, modelling is really crucial to understand the changes that we're seeing. Obviously, we rely on data to know what's actually happening, but the modelling can help us understand the causes of the changes that we're seeing in data, and importantly, how things will play out in the future. So in the UK, the kind of the chain of information is that. In the Met Office, we produce the climate change projections using our climate models, and they are used in many studies for assessing future risks. And I'm the technical lead on the UK's climate change risk assessment at the moment, and we're using that for this assessment. And then that feeds into the National Adaptation Programme. So that informs the sort of the prioritisation of adaptation actions, such as investments in improved flood defences or water infrastructure and that kind of thing. So that's sort of theoretically how it works. Of course, as I was saying, that there are large uncertainties in the future projections, so you have to be sure you're not relying on just one single model projection. If you're making a multi-billion-pound decision, you don't want to rely on just one model. You need to look at a whole range of outcomes. So that's really kind of, it's decision making under uncertainty, really. So you have to, as you say, there's a bit of a health warning there. So be wary about what you're using and don't rely on just one particular model. Yeah.
There's another really good question which tackles probably one of the more difficult parts of modelling, and I'd like to open it up to Aditi and Richard on this. How do we improve the water quality of lakes and wetlands, which are deteriorating day by day, enable us good water quality around the world? So water quality, we've talked about water quantity a lot in this webinar. Aditi?
To me, while there are important climate change links, but I think water quality is, like most other water related, a very much a governance issue. And I don't know if there's any answer that can be given in terms of how to improve water quality. I think it's a whole range of things, starting from regulation, reducing incentives for dumping, whatever from industrial waste and things like that. And many countries have worked on further tightening their pollution control norms. And I think that's where, and those norms have to be in the form of carrots and sticks, because again, in the global south, it's not that we don't have laws and regulations. Here, the implementation is the main challenge. So whatever makes that implementation easy, and there I think the role of data. And there was also a very interesting question in the context of what also Richard said, that for good modeling, you also need good data. And many of our countries do not have enough density of these, say, hydromet stations or data of a lot of kinds. So I think with the water quality also generating a good time series data of the quality, and then doing, incentivizing the polluters. Yeah, that's
Thank you. And we're getting some good responses here about stop dumping, and so finding industry and people for one of it. I'd like to close out my role here and hand back to Jeff as the facilitator of this whole webinar, and he's asked to ask one question. So back to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Rachel. Excellent presentations. I kind of put some of the presentations together into a question. So Giriraj was saying that 95% of funds are normally earmarked for mitigation, leaving 5% for adaptation. And I have heard similar numbers thrown around. And what Richard said, that we are tracking a two-degree future. You could argue that all the money we're pumping into mitigation is arguably not working, and instead that we should be pumping more money into adaptation. Now, if we link this to what Aditi said, that adaptation is water, it leads me to the conclusion that water should be central at the COPs. And I've been to the COPs, and water is not central at the COPs. So maybe my question or one of my leading thoughts is that how do we make sure that water is central at COP26 coming up at the end of this year? And I don't know if there's any responses from the audience. We've got 2 minutes left.
So I can quickly offer some thoughts on that. So adaptation will be a central theme of COP26. So I think it's probably up to all of us here to make sure that the water component of that adaptation theme really shines through.
I think that's a good answer. It's up to us. Part of it.
I think that's the answer. It's up to us. So with that thought, that concludes today's webinar. Please make sure that you register for the next webinar, which is the same time, same day, but in 2 weeks' time, where IWMI will be bringing us some experts to discuss on the water, energy, food nexus, water productivity, and water accounting. So until then, stay safe. Bye for now. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Goodbye.